What's going on, everyone? Today, as you guys can see up here, we have stem changers in el pretérito. And as you guys already know, el pretérito is the past tense, or one of the past tenses. We'll get to el imperfecto, or the imperfect tense, shortly. And then we'll talk about the difference between el pretérito y el imperfecto, so the difference between preterite and perfect. So we'll get to that later. But today, I want to look at stem changers and the preterite. And this is pretty challenging. And so hopefully we can walk through this in somewhat of a systematic way and at least make understanding it a bit clearer, right? And so in terms of the preterite, we've already looked at what we call the regular preterite, right? And that's just AR, ER, and IR verbs. We drop the ending, we add our appropriate conjugation to it. And that's, a regular verb. In other words, it doesn't break any rules. It follows, all of the rules we have. And like I said, which is dropping the ending and adding the appropriate conjugation. Now, the only endings I have up here today are actually ER, IR endings, but we're only going to be concerned actually with IR verbs today. And I'll explain why in a minute. But again, we've looked at regular verbs. And then the other one we looked at as well with regard to the preterite was car, gar, zar verbs, and that only was in the first person, so the jo form. And that was where the car changed to Q-U-E with an accent, of course, because it was jo. Gar changed to G-U-E with an accent, and zar changed to C-E with an accent. And that was the only time with those, of course, AR verbs that ended with zar, gar, and car. That's the only tweak that you find. Everything else is totally normal. And so, again, that happened in the first person singular, so jo, right? That's where that happened. And so the third thing we're going to look at today, or number 3 on the list, is what I have up here. And that's stem changers in the preterite. And so I give you a little bit of a review on that because in much of the same way, car, gar, zar is only for one person in the preterite. The stem changers in the preterite are only going to apply to, well, technically 2, but third person. So third person is singular and third person plural. But we'll get into how that works here in a second. So I just want to remind you guys of that. Like I said, I put the endings up. Notice the AR endings aren't up there because it won't apply at all to stem changers. So it didn't feel like there wasn't a sense in wasting any space. So we have I con acento, iste, io, imos, istes, ieron. So our conjugations are up here. So we got yo, tú, usted, el, ella, nosotros, vosotros, and then ustedes, ellos, ellas. So really, we're going to be concerned with third person, singular, and plural today. So that's those endings, actually. We're going to conjugate the verbs for all of the endings, but this is where the action is going to happen today. This is where the stem change, it's going to be in the third person, singular, plural. And I'm about to show you what I mean by that. So if you come over here, right, where it says criteria, so I'm going to break it down for you all and much of us in a way that's somewhat, like I said, systematic or mechanical so that you can understand how this works, right? And so let's check out the criteria. So it must be an IR verb, right? And I need to put IR. Let's put verb there, just so we're clear. So it needs to be an IR verb, right? That means ARs and ERs are already out, right? And it must be, right? Notice both say it must be. This is not an either or. This is both, right? So it must be an IR verb, right? And it must be a stem changer in the present indicative, right? So if it's a stem changer in the present indicative and it's an IR verb, it's going to be a stem changer in the preterite. And so, like I said, if so, right? If it meets these 2 criteria, it will stem change in the third person singular and plural of the preterite, right? And we're going to get to some examples here in a minute. And I marked right here, there's 2 types of stem changers in the preterite. There's O to U and E to I. Now, just as a little bit of a review, you guys are already familiar with. So I put here stem changer in the present indicative. And just for the record, stem changers in the present indicative, there was 3, right? Technically 4 if we want to count the U to UE for jugar. So let's write them up here just so we're aware of all the ones that exist in the present indicative. And then we'll get back to the preterite. So we had E to I, we had E to IE, we had O to UE, and we had U to UE. So those are the 4 types of stem changers. Like I say, I typically say 3 or 3.5 because this one really is associated with the verb jugar, right? But nevertheless, it is a stem changer, and so we're going to put it up there, and so you can see those right there. Now, what was an O to UE stem changer in the present indicative is going to actually become an O to U in the preterite. And then these 2 right here, what was an E to I, and also what was an E to IE, is going to become an E to I stem changer in the preterite. And so let's have a look. I've got a list here, and let's just have a little fun. Let's just look at which ones fit our criteria, and then we'll have a look at 3 different conjugations here. So yeah, let's just have a look just for fun, right? So we have sugerir. Is sugerir an IR verb? Well, yep, it's definitely an IR verb because we can see it right there. Is it a stem changer in the present indicative? Yes, it is, right? Sugiero, right? So it's actually an E to IE stem change in the present indicative. How about vivir? Is vivir an IR verb? Well, yep, it is. Is it a stem changer in the present indicative? No, it's not. So we're going to put an X. So anywhere we get 2 X's, or sorry, 2 check marks rather, right? That's going to be one that's going to meet our criteria. So that one is going to do a 3rd person singular and plural stem change in the preterite, right? And again, we're gonna walk through this. So dormir, is it an IR verb? Yep, sure is. Is it a stem changer in the present indicative? Yep, it's an it's an O to UE stem change, right? So that O changes to a UE. So we say duermo, for example. Encontrar, AR verb, stem changer, yes. AR verb, so it's not an IR verb, so it's out, right? Perder, stem change, yep. Pierdo, it's an E to IE stem change, but it's an ER verb, so we get a check and an X. Morir, is it an IR verb? Yep. Is it a stem changer? Absolutely. It's an O to UE stem change, just like dormir. So it's muero, for example. Yo muero, right? So it's a O to UE. Preferir, IR verb, check, right? Is it a stem change? Prefiero, yep, it is. Prefiero, it's an E to IE stem change. So prefiero, so that's going to meet our criteria, right? So we get a check, 2 checks here, 2 checks here, and 2 checks here. So we're looking good so far. How about asistir? Asistir is definitely an IR verb, but it's regular. It's a regular IR verb in the present tense. So we'll give it a check and an X. How about pedir? Pedir is definitely an IR verb, and it's an E to I stem change in the present indicative. So we'll give that a double check mark because it meets our criteria. How about repetir? Repetir is definitely an IR. Repito, yo repito, right? So it's an E to I change in the present indicative. So it gets 2 check marks as well. How about jugar? I mentioned jugar over here as a U to UE stem change. So it is a stem change in the present indicative. Yo juego. But as you can see here, it's an AR verb, so it doesn't count. We'll give it a check and an X just to let it feel special, right? So we have seguir. This is the last one in our sort of list here. I mean, there's many more, but this was just for some fun, right? So seguir is an IR verb. Is seguir a stem changer? Yes. Sigo, right? Yo sigo, right? And so that's an E to I change. So we're going to go ahead and give it a double check, right? Now, the ones that get a double check meet our criteria. What was our criteria? must be an IR verb, and must have been a stem changer in the present indicative, right? So that was our criteria. If it met that criteria, right? If so, right, then in the third person singular and plural, right, that's where the change happens. That's why I marked this earlier, right? So what's the change that we keep talking about? Again, I already mentioned it, but it's worth mentioning again. If it's an O to UE stem change, right, or U to UE, which won't exist in this situation, so we're looking over here at, for example, I have written here, dormir, right? We acknowledge that in the present tense, the present indicative, dormir was an O to UE stem changer. If it's an O to UE stem changer in the present indicative, in the preterite, it's going to be O to U. That's the little change it makes. And let's have a look at that one. So again, like I said, everything is totally normal except for the third person, right? And so let's have a look. So yo is as we expect it to be. Dormi, right? Normal, drop the IR, add the appropriate conjugation, right? Dormi, right? We add that, right? It's totally normal. Again, dormiste, normal, right? Here's where things start to tweak, right? Dormio is your third person singular. So that O, right, becomes a U. That's the only change you do. So when we say stem changers, that's what we're talking about. For nosotros, and vosotros for that matter, right, you have dormimos with an O, dormimos, and dormistes, right? So those are good. And then we get down to the third person plural, durmieron, durmieron. Again, that O changes to U, right? So what was an O is now a U. So durmieron. That's all you get, right? And when we talk of stem changers in the preterite, this is what we're talking about. Let's have a look at pedir. And just for the record, I gave an example. Again, this is an O to UE. This in the present indicative is an E to I stem change. And this one in the present indicative is an E to IE stem change. So I wanted to give you guys an example of each just to show you how, of course, these two, their stem change in the preterite is E to I, actually. Let's put the dot over the line and make it a real I, right? And so as I said, what was an E to I or E to IE change in the present indicative becomes an E to I in the preterite as a stem changer. So hopefully that makes sense. So let's take a look at pedir. By the way, pedir means to ask for. So again, right out of the gates for Joe, it's regular. Pedi, right? To pediste. Nothing weird here. Usted, él, ella, pidió. Pidió. So there's an I here, right? That E changes to an I. Again, met our criteria, and so it has to be a stem changer in the third person, singular and plural. So it's doing what it's supposed to do, right? Pedimos, right? Pedimos, nosotros. Pedisteis, right? Vosotros. And then pidieron, right? For the ustedes, ellos, ellas form. And so, again, that E, what was an E, is now an I. And so, again, there's another example of a stem changer. And let's look here at preferir, right? Preferir, to prefer. That's what that means, right? And again, out of the gates with Joe, it's normal. Preferir, right? Preferir, to preferiste, following our rules, right? Now we get here to the third person. Prefirió, right? Notice that what was an E here, and of course, over here and here is going to become an I here for the third person singular. It's going to do it again here, and I'll highlight it when I get to it. But prefirió, right? It's not an E, it's an I now. And then for the nosotros preferimos, right? And then vosotros preferisteis, right? And so again, those are following our regular rules. They aren't doing anything odd, right? And so we get down here to third person plural, ustedes, ellos, ellas, and you have prefirieron, right? You get that change there. And so really, that these are three really good examples of how the preterite stem changers work, right? And again, just as a bit of a review with the criteria, it must be an IR verb. It must be a stem changer in the present indicative. So in other words, ARs and ERs do not stem change in the preterite, right? And so I hope that I made that clear. However, those that are that fall inside of this criteria, IR and stem change, you have two options, right? You have E to I and you have O to U, right? And of course, that will be based off of what it was as a stem changer in the present indicative, of course. And so, again, dormir is a classic example. It was O to UE in the present tense, so it's just going to be an O to U in the preterite tense. And that's going to happen in the third person, right? Third person singular and third person plural. Likewise, the E to I, pretty logical, right? So clearly that would be an E to I in the preterite. And then lastly, your E to IEs in the present tense are going to be your E to Is in the preterite. So hopefully that makes sense to you all, and hopefully this has been helpful in sort of wrapping your head around this stem change tweak in the preterite and pretérito.